March 3rd, 1944. East Anglia, England. Lieutenant William Overstreet sat alone in his quarters, the low hum of generators outside blending with the distant roar of engines being tested. His pencil trembled slightly, not from fear, but exhaustion, as he wrote to his sweetheart back in Virginia. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "we're doing something they all said was impossible. Flying all the way to Berlin and back, in a single-seat fighter." Through the frosted window, he could see ground crews working beneath harsh floodlights, fitting strange, cylindrical objects beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustang. They looked almost comical, like oversized packages wrapped in brown paper, not the sort of thing you'd trust with your life. Some of the boys were calling them paper bags. When Overstreet asked if they were serious, his crew chief had only laughed. "They're laminated paper and plastic resin, Lieutenant. Same stuff the Brits have been using. They'll hold long enough to get you there and back." What no one fully grasped that night was that the mathematics of air warfare were about to be rewritten, not by armor or engine power, but by compressed paper soaked in resin, made in an old newspaper factory. The crisis that led to this began months earlier, October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday, at Halesworth Airfield, Colonel Hubert Zemke stared grimly at the operations board. Reports came in like obituaries. 60 B-17s gone, 600 men, in a single day. Of the 291 bombers that had taken off for Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, over a quarter never came home. The Luftwaffe had waited just beyond the Thunderbolt's range, and when the American Escort turned back, the German fighters swarmed. A ball turret gunner named Robert Morgan recalled it later with cold clarity. "We were sitting ducks for 3 hours. Once the little friends turned back, Jerry came at us in waves." The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, but with its standard fuel tanks, it could only reach about 375 miles. Berlin was nearly twice that distance. In a quiet corner of the 8th Air Force's technical office at Bovington, a colonel named Cass Hoof was studying something that looked more like a school art project than a weapon of war. A fuel tank made entirely of paper, laminated craft paper bonded with resin, shaped over wooden forms, and sealed with fire-resistant lacquer. It came from Bowater Lloyd, a British company that once printed the London Times. Aluminum was scarce, but paper was plentiful. What began as Britain's solution to a material shortage soon became America's answer to a strategic crisis. These tanks were feather-light, only 50 pounds empty, compared to 150 for the metal kind. That meant more fuel, more range, and more possibilities. The first test came in February 1944. Major James Goodson of the 56th Fighter Group took his P-47 aloft with a pair of these strange, silver-painted paper tanks. He returned from Hanover reporting they'd performed flawlessly. No leaks, no failures. The skeptics were silenced, at least for a moment. Then came the arrival of the P-51B Mustang. It was sleek, fast, and efficient. A perfect match for the new drop tanks. With two 108-gallon paper tanks beneath its wings, the Mustang's range leapt to 850 miles. Suddenly, Berlin, once untouchable, was within reach. On the morning of March 4th, 1944, the briefing room at Debden Airfield fell silent as the mission map was unveiled. A red line stretched from East Anglia straight into the heart of Germany. For the first time, single-engine fighters would escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. "You could hear a pin drop," one pilot recalled. Then someone just whispered, "Berlin," and everyone knew history was about to change. Outside, crew chiefs had been filling the paper tanks since 3 in the morning. They had to work quickly. Gasoline would slowly eat through the resin after 5 hours. But that was all the Mustangs needed. Each tank held precisely 108 gallons of high-octane fuel. 3 main parts, nose cone, tail cone, and the body, laminated and hand-finished by women working in repurposed newspaper plants. These weren't factory-line mechanics. They were paper mill workers, artisans who understood texture and grain, now saving lives through their precision. When the first wave of Mustangs lifted off into the gray dawn, no one knew if the tanks would hold. But they did. Perfectly. Over Berlin, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe their eyes. American fighters, over their capital, their intelligence had sworn this was impossible. Ball turret gunner Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group remembered looking up from his B-17 and seeing the gleaming contrails of Mustangs above them. One pilot dipped his wings, and Rice saw the paper tanks under them. "That's when we knew," he said. "We weren't alone anymore." From that day forward, the air war over Germany would never be the same. In the months that followed, bomber losses plummeted. What had once been slaughter over Schweinfurt and Regensburg now became sustainable missions. By May 1944, loss rates dropped from over 7% per month to barely 2%. Thousands of airmen lived because of a few hundred pounds of paper and glue. Republic aviation engineers soon realized these tanks offered even more benefits. They caused less drag than metal tanks. When hit by gunfire, they didn't explode. They simply tore open and leaked. And after the war, farmers found they biodegraded into the soil, leaving only a few metal fittings behind. The Germans tried to copy the idea, but their war economy was collapsing. Paper mills were busy printing maps. Resin went into aircraft construction, and the distributed home workshop manufacturing the Allies used simply didn't exist in Germany. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. German pilots were being sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time. The Americans, with paper-fed range, dominated the skies. Everywhere the Luftwaffe went, the Mustangs were already there, over airfields, railways, even the heart of Berlin itself. Fighter aces like Francis Gabby Gabreski and Don Gentilo flew mission after mission with paper tanks, swearing by their reliability. Gabreski's after-action report from July 1944 noted perfect tank performance at -40 degrees and flawless release. Under combat stress, the tanks were now produced in the tens of thousands. Bowater Lloyd's newspaper machines churned out war supplies instead of newsprint. Women worked 3 shifts a day, laminating, gluing, and sealing tanks that would be used only once, but whose single use might mean saving a bomber crew of 10. As the Allies pushed into France, the logistical advantages multiplied. Paper tanks were cheap, light, and could be shipped flat. A single transport plane could carry hundreds. They could even be dropped by parachute to forward airfields. By the time of D-Day, Allied fighters were operating everywhere, from Normandy beaches to the outskirts of Paris, thanks to those disposable tanks. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the freezing winter of 1944, Mustangs still launched 3 or 4 sorties a day, re-equipped in under 20 minutes. The system worked flawlessly. Even German intelligence officers, captured after the war, admitted the truth. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann told interrogators that the paper tank changed everything. It meant nowhere in the Reich was safe from fighter attack. By late 1944, German fuel production was collapsing. Their aircraft factories were being hit daily. Fighter output fell 40%, but even those planes couldn't fly. There was no fuel left to power them. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top ace, said it best after the war. When the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost. The irony was almost poetic. An empire that built rockets and jet fighters had been undone by paper and glue. After the war, the influence of the paper drop tank lived on. The lamination techniques developed for them became the foundation for early composite materials and even the first printed circuit boards. The same presses that once rolled newspaper tanks were later used to make television cabinets and aircraft panels. Wing Commander Peter Brothers of the RAF once said, "The British gave the Americans the idea. The Americans gave it mass production, and together they bought the bombers safe passage to Berlin." By the final months of the war, paper tanks were everywhere. More than 15,000 were dropped over Europe, vanishing into fields and forests with the rain. Their contribution was quiet, but decisive. In 1946, General James Doolittle summarized it best in his report to Congress. The extension of fighter range through the British-made paper tanks was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe. From a newspaper mill in Kent to the skies over Berlin, the paper drop tank story is a lesson in wartime ingenuity, a triumph of simplicity over complexity. Lieutenant Overstreet, the young man who wrote that letter to Virginia, survived the mission. His Mustang returned safely that day, its paper tanks long gone, jettisoned somewhere over the German countryside. He never knew exactly where they fell, only that they carried him farther than anyone had believed possible. Those tanks, cheap, temporary, almost laughable, gave the Allies what they needed most: reach. And that reach changed the course of the air war, proving once and for all that sometimes the simplest solutions, the ones born from necessity, from scarcity, can carry within them the fuel for victory.